Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We did just relaunch the sale. It had been a few months, so if you have been waiting to sign up for ITC Premium, you should do so now because now you can get the sale price and lock in the lower rate as long as you do not cancel. Let's go ahead and jump in. So it's been a pretty interesting week in the cryptoverse. Bitcoin is below $60,000. And if you think about it, there haven't been many times really since February that we even saw Bitcoin go below 60K. And certainly right now, we're seeing it spend a lot more time below 60K than we have over the last several months. So I think a lot of people were very hopeful that we wouldn't go below 60K and that it would hold as support. But again, the market will always keep us on our toes and keep market participants guessing as to, where price action is going to take us next. We've got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about a lot of different things where we are, in a theoretical market cycle. If you believe in that, we're going to make some comparisons to prior cycles. At the end of the day, again, despite the comparisons that we might make, you should remember that this cycle will, of course, have its own nuances to it. It's not going to behave like any other cycle to the T, and we should not assume that it will. I think a lot of people compare this cycle to 2016. I have made comparisons to 2019, but I think the reality is that it's going to be 2024. It's not going to be exactly like 2019. It's not going to be exactly like 2016. It's 2024, and we'll see what happens. But let's go ahead and jump into what's actually going on. So right now, Bitcoin is at around $58,000. This has been a pretty big sell-off this week, but it's actually up quite a bit from this recent low. What's interesting, if you zoom in here, there's actually a trend line that you can look at and see that it's been holding support on that trend line right there, right? You see? And so the first time that we really tagged this trend line when we sort of created it was back when Bitcoin was around 59.5K. We tagged it again at around 56.8K in early May. We just tagged this trend line again at 53.6K in July. So this trend line is I think somewhat important to follow. Okay? You could also draw a similar trend line at the top as well. It doesn't fit exactly the same in the sense that it's not really a parallel channel because you can see this kind of is a little bit more extended there to the upside. But I want to at least talk about this trend line for a little bit and talk about how we did see something similar in 2019. If you rewind the clock and you go back to 2019, something very similar happened as well, where essentially, you had a low and then you started basically connecting these lower lows on this trend line. In fact, the pandemic crash ultimately went slightly below that trend line, but we did not have any daily closes below it. But do you see how in 2019 we had these tests of the trend line? And it was basically after the fourth test of the trend line, we actually were able to break out of this, right? We actually were able to break out of it. We then back tested it, held it as support, started to go back up, but then ended up being a double top on, say, that lower time frame right there. And then we had the final capitulation crash. So I want to talk about that a little bit because, again, if we had had a soft landing last cycle, this might have been the bottom, right? In November of 2019, right? That might have been the bottom had it been a soft landing. And maybe it would have been a soft landing if the pandemic hadn't happened. No one really knows, right? We can't possibly know, but we ended up getting a hard landing when it was all said and done, and you can see it when you zoom out. But again, what you notice is that there was a similar trend line, right, that we were holding as support in the downtrend, right? It was lower highs and lower lows, so it was clearly a downtrend channel, but ultimately we eventually broke out of it. Right? We eventually broke out of it. It took a while to break out of it, right? If you actually look at a sort of a time range on this from that top that set the, from when Bitcoin topped to when it actually broke out of this channel, excluding the pandemic crash, it took about 202 days, right? It was quite a while, quite a while. if you look at where Bitcoin is right now and how long it has been in this channel, so far it's been about 114 days or so, 115 days. 202 days would actually put you all the way out in October, in the October timeframe. So it's kind of interesting to think about in terms of where we are. So in the short term, there is a chance that this trend line might become important. That doesn't mean it's going to play out exactly like 2019. We've already tagged it 3 times. In 2019, we had a similar channel. I think we tagged it, 3 or 4 times before we ended up breaking out above it. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind, right? The first time we tagged it was over here at around 59.5, then 56.5, then 53.5, right? It's just gone down by about $3,000 every single time. So if we were to say, all right, well, what happens if we tag this trend line again, but it tags it at 50K? How long would that take to get there? That would put you out, or let's say 53.5. That would put you in September, right? And if you actually look at the time between tagging these trend lines, that was about 2 months. And then here is about 2 months, right? So again, if you go about 2 months out from there, that would also put you that September timeframe, approximately that September timeframe. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about. Now, I think there are still some elements of 2019 that are relevant, I think. Again, I know I get a lot of flack for comparing this cycle or comparing this year to 2019. And I understand the reasoning, of course, but I cannot help but feel, there are some similarities still that warrant our attention. For instance, I do remember in 2019, there were a lot of people calling for a left translated peak for Bitcoin, basically where the peak occurs much earlier than the prior peaks. If you think about it, Bitcoin had a peak in December of 2013. Okay, we'll outline these. So we have November of 2013, December of 2017, and then November of 2021. And so even last cycle, there was a lot of discussion about a potential left translated peak because of how quickly Bitcoin was moving. And then, of course, what ended up happening is Bitcoin essentially went nowhere for a year, right? I mean, from this high here, we didn't durably take that high out for over a year. But had you only looked at this move, had that move continued, you wouldn't, you could understand how it could be a left translated peak, right? In fact, back then, I think a lot of people thought it might do something like this, right? Where you get this like 80% pullback and then you get another massive rally, right? We had this 80% pullback. And then I think a lot of people were thinking, all right, we'll just straight back up to a higher high. And then what happened was we ended up cooling off for over a year as we got into the rate cut part of the cycle. Now, I will point out that last cycle, Bitcoin did not top until 1 month before the first rate cut. So there is still theoretically a chance that something like that could play out again. The one thing, though, that I go back to in relation to 2019 is what gold did in 2019. And again, this is something we talked about for a long time leading up to this. In 2019, we saw gold break out above these range highs. And when it broke out, it was not a market cycle top for Bitcoin, but it was a local top that remained a top for far longer than people thought it was going to, right? Over a year before Bitcoin took out that high. Again, history does not have to repeat itself exactly, but back in March, I did say, we have videos from back then where I said, look, guys, gold looks like it's starting to break out here. And sure enough, we rewind the clock, we see that gold durably broke out in March, and coincidentally, that happened to correspond to a at least local top for Bitcoin that at this point, I think has already lasted longer than a lot of people thought it would. And again, at this point, it hasn't even been that long if you compare what happened in 2019, right? If you look at where Bitcoin hit these local highs back at like 73K, when was that? Was this week right here, March 11th. It's only been about 15 weeks. Again, in 2019, it was at like 60 weeks before that high was ultimately taken out. And so that is something that I still find relevant. Now, again, at the end of the day, I mean, I think what makes the most sense with Bitcoin is to come up with a DCA strategy according to risk levels that make the most sense for you rather than trying to time every single move. That's the way that I've been successful in this market. I have not been successful by trying to identically time tops and identically time bottoms. I just DCA at low risk levels into the market and I DCA out at high risk levels. In 2019, the risk level of Bitcoin went to like the 0.6 to 0.7 risk band. So it was only slightly elevated. It would have called for taking some profits if you would, if for my risk tolerance strategy, but only a small amount. Now, of course, it would have been nice to take more given what ended up happening, but, I didn't know that it was going to happen like that. So I took, you can take some profits at higher risk levels. But again, this is ultimately what came later. So I don't really care that much. Same thing, right? Same thing this time around, right? We did go to elevated risk levels again at 73K. It allows those that want to reduce some risk to do so. But it could still play out in a similar fashion as 2019, right? Where it's kind of a slow grind for a while. But once that QE kicks back in sometime later on this cycle, then maybe things get moving once again. But again, there's a lot of different opinions, and I respect a lot of these different opinions because I have to admit I don't know what's going to happen. I just, we're looking at these different probabilities and trying to figure out, all right, what's the most likely scenario. Now, my base case would still be that this cycle is like prior cycles where you could still see a rally top out in Q4 of the post-halving year. That would, of course, be 2025. There are a lot of people in the left translated cycle camp just because of how quickly the Bitcoin run-up has occurred. Now, if you were to look at the ROI from the halving, I think a lot of people just look at what happened last halving and realize that, hey, the price only went up after the halving in terms of it didn't go below the price at the halving. But if you look at 2 cycles ago, you can see that Bitcoin did go below where it was at the halving after the halving, and it took a while for the market to pick back up after that. So that's something to consider. Also, if you look at the ROI after cycle peak, there was once upon a time last cycle where we were really far extended above where the prior cycle was, and then there ended up being this mean reversion back down to where the prior cycle was. I've argued this for a long time that you might be seeing something very similar this cycle where there's this like mean reversion back down to where these prior cycles are. To put the prior cycles into perspective, right? It might not look like we're that far above it, but if you go over here, you can see that at this point in the cycle, as measured peak to peak for the last 2 cycles, Bitcoin was still down 40 to 50% from the all-time high. If you were to go look at 40 to 50% down from the all-time high for this cycle, compared to the peak from the prior cycle, 69K, 40% down would be at like 41 to 42K. 50% down puts you at like 34 to 35K. So it just shows you how far extended we are. Now, last cycle, there was a lot of talk about it being a left translated cycle peak as well because of this move, right? Because of this move that we saw Bitcoin have, where it was absolutely going parabolic in the pre-halving year. And then the market just went nowhere for over a year, and then we picked back up after QE arrived. But it allowed people to sort of see the different sides of the market. There's been a lot of discussion recently as to this divergence between Bitcoin and the S&P 500. And the reason I think about it is because I like looking for similarities between different years. And I keep going back to the 2019 comparison, mainly because it was also a year that the Fed pivoted, and I think that monetary policy plays a role. And again, you may have noticed that there's been a divergence between Bitcoin and the S&P 500, right? You see this right here, like the S&P continues to climb. The S&P continues to climb here, but Bitcoin has faded. There's a divergence there. This divergence is something we also saw in 2019, right? This is exactly what we saw in 2019. In fact, you can see right here, right? The S&P kept climbing while Bitcoin faded. It's kind of the same thing when you think about it. When you overlay net liquidity, like global net liquidity, it all sort of let me go to the ITC net liquidity. This is sort of an approximation of global net liquidity. If we move this to the pane above, what you'll notice is that there's times when Bitcoin will diverge, from net liquidity, right? It'll diverge from it, and you can see that pretty clearly, right? There are times where it diverges, and then there are times where the jaws clamp shut, and that net liquidity, the price goes to where that net liquidity is. Qualitatively, of course, you can see here the jaws opened right here. So I think it's interesting because, like, as you look at different asset classes, you can see those jaws open. But what's more fascinating to me is that I don't really think the net liquidity is a great predictor of the price of Bitcoin. What I think net liquidity is a great predictor of is alt Bitcoin pairs, right? If you look at alt Bitcoin pairs, they basically just track net liquidity, okay? Net liquidity doesn't really give you insight into the USD valuations, but it does give you insight, in my opinion, into higher risk assets against lower risk assets. And you can see that as net liquidity drops, so too does the valuation of altcoins against Bitcoin. So, thinking back to where we are right now in the context of history, you have Bitcoin diverging from the S&P 500, which is exactly what it did in 2019, right? You see that it's diverging from the S&P 500. This is the same thing that happened in 2019, where the S&P kept going up, Bitcoin started going down, okay? We also, again, as I previously mentioned, we saw gold break out in 2019. And when it broke out, it marked a local top for Bitcoin. Again, it wasn't the market cycle top, if you believe in a theoretical concept that we just made up of market cycles, right? But it was a top that lasted for longer than people thought. That's the point. It wasn't. It sort of broke the bull trend, right? It broke the bull trend up, and then we ended up going down for a little while, going back up, and then getting demolished, and then going back up as the money printers came back on. So you see that it basically broke that bull trend up. So we saw the same thing happen here, right? Where gold durably breaks out in March, which coincidentally is right around the time that Bitcoin hit a local top. Back in March, I don't think there are going to be many people that would have told you that by July, Bitcoin still wouldn't have taken out that high. But we said many, many times that there was a very similar thing that occurred with Ethereum during the merge, right? And we'll talk about this, and you can actually see how it relates to Bitcoin as well. If you go back to the merge, what you'll notice is that ETH put in a high 1 month before the merge, right? This was 1 month before the merge, and then here was the merge. And then it ended up putting in a lower high, right? It put in a lower high, and then after putting in that lower high, it came down, and then it went back up. But it only went back up because Bitcoin lifted it up, right? Bitcoin lifted it up. We know that because the ETH Bitcoin pair has, was bleeding for that entire time, right? ETH Bitcoin was bleeding. So the only reason ETH was really going up was because Bitcoin was lifting it up. You could actually argue that the same thing started to happen in 2019, right? So Bitcoin had, a couple, it had some pullbacks here that you can see, right? It had a few pullbacks, tagged the trend line a few times. But then it's almost like the S&P was lifting Bitcoin up, right? Overlay the S&P onto this chart. In the same way that, that Bitcoin lifted ETH up in 2019, you could argue that the S&P, as it just kept on rallying, started to lift Bitcoin up eventually. But it took several, lower highs for that to actually happen. And again, if you look at this trend line here, you could argue that we are in a similar one in 2023, right? A very similar trend line. And, you could argue that if we continue to have, these bounces back to the bottom part of that trend line, that is the trend line to sort of watch. As long as it holds, then, or I would assume that is the line that the bulls would want to hold at all costs, to not go below that trend line, just like they tried to hold it in 2019. And they did hold it in 2019. The only time they actually broke through it was when we actually had a recession, and then it ended up just being a wick below it. But I think that's the trend line to watch, is this one right here. which means that, the amount of time it would take for that trend line to get to 50K would be a couple months from now, right? About a couple months from now. Now, in the meantime, we know that Bitcoin has fallen below both its 20-week SMA and 21-week EMA. But again, to me, it looks like this is happening about 1 month earlier in the year as it did last time, right? So if you look at last year, we had a local top in April, and then we fell below the bull market support band in August. This time we had a local top in March, and then we fell below the bull market support band in July. Now, technically speaking, Bitcoin did sweep the highs in June. We said, look, we could see something very similar, although I did speculate that it could, in fact, be a lower high if it's going to play out like 2019, where essentially you have a high in March, a lower high in April, a lower high in May, and then you end up dropping down, just like we did in 2019. And look, guys, I mean, a lot of the influencers out there were super bullish up here. And look, there's nothing wrong with being wrong, right? I'm wrong a lot. But I do think there should be a little bit more self-accountability for people, right? If you were doing nothing but bull posting up here, don't just post inspirational quotes down here. Just be like, all right, I was wrong, because there's nothing wrong with being wrong, because we're all wrong, right? We're all wrong. But I think at this point, the key thing to watch will be this trend line, a very similar trend line as we saw in 2019. Okay. And, we held it in 2019. There's no guarantee we hold it in 2024, but that, I think, is where that, where the market's looking towards to try and bounce from. The main areas of resistance, okay? If we get, and again, at this point, we still don't even have a weekly close below the bull market support band. You might say, well, Ben, we've been below the 20-week SMA for a couple weeks. Yeah, but the bull market support band also consists of the 21-week EMA, and we haven't had a weekly close below that just yet. Okay, so I mean, at this point, it is kind of similar to what we saw last year. It's also happening just about the same time, just 1 month ahead. So we will keep an eye on that. For sure. But I would say, the main areas of resistance now that Bitcoin is down here are likely going to be your 8-week moving average and your 20-week SMA, which coincidentally, right now, they're both at around 65K. So that's going to be your area of resistance instantaneously. Of course, it is a moving target. The longer Bitcoin spins down here, the more they would, continue to slowly roll over. Now, I want to mention something, not necessarily because I'm a big believer in it, but I just want to put this out there for the people that subscribe to the left translated peak theory, okay? Which is a valid theory. And again, at some point, we likely will have a left translated peak, and maybe this is a cycle where it happens. It's not necessarily my base case at this point, but I do want to at least put it out there, mainly because, we do have an inverted yield curve. We know what normally happens in history when that happens. And so I just want to put it out there for the people that are in the left translated camp. There's a lot of people in the left translated camp that say, all right, there's going to be a left translated peak, but it's still ahead of us, right? It's not until like December, right? Which again, maybe they're right about that. If you look at last year, we had a cool off period around this time, Q3, right? Around the same time. Maybe we just have the same thing where we just spent a few weeks below the 20-week SMA and we pick back up in Q4. I mean, that's what essentially happened in 2013. We basically saw the market cool off, and then it actually ended up bottoming out in early July, in fact, right? In early July. If you look at this, Bitcoin got a weekly close below the bull market support band in July, and then it just picked back up, right? It picked back up, and then by the end of the year, we had a higher peak. You see that? So you can't ignore that, right? You can't ignore that. There are similarities to it because you also had, a series of lower highs that occurred, right? You had a high, you had a lower high, and then a lower high in May, and then you ended up basically capitulating down that first week of July. And then the following week, we saw the market get right back up, and then it continued on, and then got back above the bull market support band as August and September arrived. Now, I wouldn't look at that and say that it has to play out in the same way. Obviously, this market was a lot more explosive back over here, but you still have to like at least think that hey, maybe there's some relevance to something like that, especially if you're in the left translated peak camp, right? If you're in the left translated peak camp and you think there's going to be a peak at the end of the year, then you would want to see Bitcoin get back above its bull market support band soon. All right. If you look at 2019, you'll notice that it didn't get back above its bull market support band soon, right? It basically just ended up holding it as resistance. And it also fell below the 20-week SMA in the third quarter of the year, right? In the third quarter of the year. And it also had lower highs leading into it. Now, last year, we saw something very, very similar, right? We had these lower highs leading into it that really started off in June. Like we just had these lower highs. We did wick above it there. We ended up going below the 20-week SMA, and then we had another rally in Q4. You see? Right? So you essentially had your first high. We had a high in April, and then we wicked above it in June, right? But we had a high in April, and then we had another high that really topped out late December, early January with the spot ETF. So you can see that structure of 2013 actually kind of played out in 2023, 10 years later, right? This top right there was in April. And then this top here was at the end of the year. That top was in April, and then we had another rally going into the end of the year. And then this year, we had a top in March. And now it's cooled off in the summer months, right? We talked about the idea, in fact, of a summer lull. In fact, in 2021, right? It's not even just 2013. In 2021, Bitcoin capitulated below the 20-week SMA, and it ultimately ended up bottoming out about late July before it picked back up, and then it just swept the prior high. But again, there's definitely reasons to look at a left translated peak as an idea if Bitcoin's able to durably get back above its bull market support band and continue trending higher. Now, there's also this idea of a left translated peak where the peak is already in. And someone was asking this on NFA Live this past week. They're like, what's the probability the peak's already in? Look, guys, there's a probability of everything, right? I mean, the more I've been in the market, I think you just kind of have to accept that there's any outcome is theoretically, I mean, any realistic outcome is theoretically possible, right? You know, if you're going to ask, could Bitcoin be at 100K or 40K, both of those outcomes are theoretically possible. So it's important to sort of digest those different outcomes and see like, all right, well, which one is it actually following? Which one is it not? So I would say the one thing to keep in the back of your mind, if you are in the left translated peak camp, is this is a really cool thing to look at. And again, I think this is interesting whether it's a left translated peak or not. But if you take a fib retracement from the 2017 peak to that, 2018 low, Bitcoin identically retraced to the 4.236. Do you see that? And we talked about this back in March, by the way. We talked about this back in March. The reason that's interesting, because at this point it's not really that interesting, it's just a line on the screen. And there's been plenty of instances with other asset classes where they eventually go above the 4.236, right? If you were to look at the S&P 500, or let me see if I can pull that up, right? If you were to look at the S&P 500, look at this. If you were to take, say, the retracement from that peak way down there, I mean, you can see that it eventually got above the 4.236 and just went on. So it's not like Bitcoin can't eventually do that. I want to be clear. Eventually, it probably will. But what I think is interesting is this. In 2024, Bitcoin retraced to the 4.236. But in 2021, it retraced to the 3.618. You might say, Ben, no one cares about that, right? These are just random numbers. No one really cares. But I think this is interesting. The reason is because of where the capital was allocated. Because if you look at total market cap of crypto, right? This is not just Bitcoin. This is the entire asset class. What do you notice? It's the exact opposite. Total market cap of crypto in 2021 retraced to the 4.236. But so far this cycle, it only went approximately to the 3.618. Isn't that interesting? So what has happened? Capital has rotated from altcoins to Bitcoin. And you can see that if you just overlay Bitcoin dominance onto this chart, right? You can see that when total market cap was over here, Bitcoin dominance was way over here at like 40%. Now Bitcoin dominance is like 54%, 55%, and total market cap is down here, while Bitcoin has retraced all the way up to the 4.236. So you've seen a rotation of money from altcoins to Bitcoin over the last 3 years. And you can see that pretty clearly by the fact that Bitcoin retraced to the 4.236, whereas total market cap only retraced to the 3.618. They've switched spots, right? Total market Bitcoin went from the 3.618 last cycle from the 2017 peak to the 4.236 this cycle. But so far, we've seen total market cap do the opposite. Last cycle, it went to the 4.236. This cycle, it's only gone to 3.618. A rotation of capital from altcoins to Bitcoin. So, I keep going back and forth in my mind about, is it a left translated peak? Is it not? And again, there's a lot of people that say it's a left translated peak, but the peak is still in the future. And I could be on board with that, right? Especially if Bitcoin gets back above the bull market support band in a few weeks. If it's back above it and trending up just like mid 2013, I could be on board with that idea. I got no problem with it. My only point is the prior 3 cycles, Bitcoin topped in Q4 of the post-halving year. And last cycle, there would have been reason to believe that it was going to be a left translated peak because we were so far ahead of the prior cycle, and then we ended up just getting mean reversion, and then the peak ended up coming basically when it always does. So, yes, there's evidence for a left translated peak, but there's also evidence that what happens if we just repeat what happened last cycle and we just get this mean reversion back down to where the other 2 cycles were, and then we get another push up in, say, 2025. The key will be what happens in Q4 of this year. That's the key. What happens in Q4? And I'll explain what I mean. In 2013, when we had sort of this first top and then a later top, Q4 is when it all happened, right? I mean, Q4 started right here, and that's when the market took off. If you look at last year, the market took off in Q4, right? I mean, right here. This is where October started. It took off in Q4. When did it take off? Back over here, right? You can see, I mean, it had gone up a little bit before that, but then it had another rally in Q4, and that's what ended up marking the top. 2017, you can see that the final rally occurred in Q4, right? October to December. So, if this is a left translated peak where the peak is not in already, then you would expect a rally in Q4 of this year, right? Because, I mean, if it's not a rally in Q4 and you still think the peak is ahead of us, if the peak is just in 2025, then it's just coming when it always does, right? In the post-halving year. So if you are in the left translated peak camp, where the peak is ahead of us, then Q4 would be your time to shine. Because that's when you would theoretically expect it to pick up. Now, if it's not a left translated peak, and the peak is not already in, then you would not expect a parabolic rally in Q4. Unless you just get a parabolic rally in Q4, and then there's just enough strength for it to go parabolic again for another year after that. All right, I take it back. There's always a chance that happens. But look at 2019 when the Fed cut rates. What happened after the Fed cut rates? Bitcoin went down in Q4, right? So this is Q4. Bitcoin went down in Q4 of 2019. So if Bitcoin goes down in Q4 of 2024, then maybe, and the peak's not already in, then maybe you just end up getting a peak when you normally do, right? And, perhaps Bitcoin just follows this trend line down for a little bit longer, get some type of, basically, you would get some form of something that causes the Fed to pivot and QE to begin at some point in the future. But, that hasn't happened yet. The Fed still hasn't pivoted, and as far as I know, the last time I checked the market probabilities over here, it doesn't seem like the market is expecting rate cuts at the July meeting. Um, and given where inflation has come in, you can't blame them, right? I mean, I think it's hard because there is certainly evidence to suggest that if the Fed could cut, but yeah, I mean, look at this. There's only like a 7.8% chance of a cut in late July. So if that doesn't happen, if we don't get a cut in July, then that means the next time for a cut is September, right before Q4, right? Right before Q4. So if the Fed cuts in September and then Bitcoin just bleeds after the Fed cuts, like it did last time, remember, if you overlay US interest rates onto this chart, you can see that the Fed cut in July and Bitcoin was just in a downtrend after the Fed cut. You see that? Bitcoin was just in a downtrend after the Fed started to cut. So if the Fed cuts in September and we end up getting a downtrend in Q4, then, maybe it's just going to play out like last cycle, where just simply the rate cuts are shifted in the cycle. So instead of being in the pre-halving year, they're in the halving year. Now, there's a caveat to this, because again, we know last cycle, Bitcoin didn't top until 1 month before the first rate cut, making maybe think, what if Bitcoin has another rally in August before September arrives? That's possible, right? It's possible. And I want to put that out there. To be completely honest, it's not my base case at this time. The reason it's not yet my base case is because gold already broke out. And when gold broke out in 2019, that was the local top for Bitcoin for the year. I mean, that was the yearly high for Bitcoin for the year when gold broke out. And also, if you look at the S&P 500 context as it relates to rate cuts, sometimes it tops out before rate cuts, sometimes it tops out after rate cuts. Just because Bitcoin topped out 1 month before the first rate cut last cycle doesn't mean it has to this cycle, but it's something I think we should keep in mind. The other reason that I think it could be still similar to sort of a mid 2019 is look at USDT dominance. This is something we talked about a lot earlier this year. Every time that USDT dominance has tagged this trend line, we have had a larger pullback. December 2017, and it's not all market cycle top, so get that out of here. December 2017 was a market cycle top. June 2019 was a mid-cycle top. February 2020, May of 2021, November of 2021, right? Every single time that USDT dominance hit this trend line, we had a larger pullback in the cryptoverse. And I pointed this out back in March. And I knew back then that if it was going to be similar to June of 2019, it would keep us on our toes for months and months and months before it would be obvious. And sure enough, you could say the same thing is true. I've said this before. I don't think a lot of people believe me, but I said in 2019, it's not like we knew this was happening necessarily, right? I mean, yes, it's obvious in hindsight, but when you think about it, Bitcoin was still, wicking up all the way up here, even in October, right? So, back over here, if it had just gone up a little bit more, it would have been a new yearly high. Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, you can look back and say, oh no, it was just a downtrend for 9 months, right? With the recession crash, the pandemic recession crash, it was a downtrend. But at the time, you didn't know it for sure. Even though USDT dominance had already tagged the trend line, it's not like we knew for sure. And sure enough, this time's no different, right? I mean, like, we've been putting in these lower highs since March. And in April, a lot of people thought we were about to break out. In June and May, a lot of people thought we were about to break out, but it ended up just being a lower high. So in that sense, it is still similar to 2019, right? In the way that, you've seen these, you saw gold break out and you saw USDT dominance hit. You saw gold break out of its trend line, or the gold break out of its range. You saw USDT dominance hit the trend line, and both of those times have marked local tops for, I think, longer than people thought. And in both cases, you're seeing these drops below the 20-week SMA. It's interesting, right? And maybe the trend line to look at, too, if we don't pick back up, would be something like this one, maybe. Eventually. I also think that the 2019 comparison is relevant because of alt Bitcoin pairs. Look at alt Bitcoin pairs. You see this? I mean, I know they're up this week technically speaking, but when you look at where they are right now, they're essentially right around the same spot they were at in mid 2019, right? So, I look at this stuff and I just think to myself, what if it's playing out the same way? The other thing, by the way, is ETH Bitcoin. I do think that ETH Bitcoin has this habit of basically, it'll go up and then it'll spend a lot of time at those highs before then finally falling off, right? I mean, here was a great example where you go up quickly and then you come back down and then you slowly work your way back up and then you go back down. Right? Again, here you have a top, you go down, you slowly work your way back up, you have a double top, and then you drop again. Same thing here. A top, go down, slowly work your way back up, double top. What if you're just seeing the same thing happen again, right? Where maybe the spot ETF launch causes, a wick up and then a drop. I know I have compared ETH Bitcoin a lot to 2019. And in 2019, ETH Bitcoin fell below support in July. But I got to be honest, right now, this looks more like 2016 to me. Looks more like 2016 because you had a fake out in the summer, right? You have a fake out here just before summer, go back up, get above the 20-week SMA, just kind of like right now, and then drop. Now in 2016, Bitcoin actually did go up in Q4. So you might think that ETH did as well, but guess what? It didn't, which is fascinating. How many times do you see ETH drop like this while Bitcoin is going up? Because that is exactly what happened in 2016. Bitcoin was going up, ETH was going down. Now, I kind of think at this point, they're a lot more correlated than they were in 2016. So I would assume that if Bitcoin's going down, then ETH is going down. And if Bitcoin's going up, then ETH is probably going up. But who knows? Who knows? So I think for now, I look at USDT dominance and I see, all right, it tagged the trend line at 4%. We talked about that for a long time. Gold, same thing. It durably broke up. If you were to look at Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance, guess where it is? At the same spot it was at just before the Fed cut rates in 2019. I think there's just all these false breakouts by it because rate cuts keep getting pushed off further and further into the future, right? So like last cycle, that wasn't the case. They didn't keep getting pushed further and further off. A little bit, but not nearly to the same extent. Here you can see it wants to break out, but it just keeps not doing so because the market's like, yeah, are we going to get a rate cut in September? Or are they just going to kick the can down the road again? And so it hasn't actually happened. And this isn't going to happen until alt Bitcoin pairs break down, right? Alt Bitcoin pairs broke down just before the Fed cut. Fed hasn't cut yet, and it looks like they might not even cut in July. It's taking a long time to play out. Everyone's getting exhausted by it, I think. I'm not saying you should trade this stuff. I'm just saying have a plan. If you want to buy Bitcoin according to the risk levels, you could do that. If you want to buy altcoins according to the risk levels, you could do that. I'm just trying to show these macro trends. But I do think a lot of people have followed this and they get frustrated because of how long it's taking to play out. I can't control how long it's taking to play out. I wish I could. I can't control that. All I can say is I think that altcoins are oscillators against Bitcoin at best. And if that's the case, they still have a long way to drop. And they haven't dropped yet, that final move. I don't know if that move is going to happen in Q3 or Q4. In 2019, it occurred in Q3, right? In 2016, which was a halving year, in 2016, if you were to look at the ETH Bitcoin pair, it collapsed in Q4, right? It collapsed in October, November, December. And again, ETH Bitcoin looks more similar to me than to 2016 and 2019. But then I think to myself, last cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs crashed on a Bitcoin. They broke support on a Bitcoin rally. This time, it seems like the only time they're mainly going down in the short term where they're wicking below 0.4 is on Bitcoin crashes. Have you noticed that? Let's take a look. So look at this. Like, all these moves to the downside, they keep occurring on Bitcoin drops, not Bitcoin moves up. Overlay Bitcoin USD on the chart, you'll see what I mean. So last cycle, it was a Bitcoin rally that broke alt Bitcoin pairs down. But this cycle, these moves that you're seeing recently below the support level are occurring on Bitcoin drops, right? It's different than it was last cycle. Like, they're occurring on Bitcoin drops rather than Bitcoin rallies. It's just an interesting difference, I think, because this one was on a Bitcoin rally. These have been on Bitcoin drops. So that would lead me to believe that the way that all Bitcoin pairs break down, at least recently, has been proven to be on Bitcoin drops. So that might be what has to happen for could it be Bitcoin drops to 50K in September? Could it be that it drops below 50K, goes to 40K, or even, what if it does something like that? Is that the way they break down? Or is it on a Bitcoin rally where Bitcoin goes manic in Q4 like it did in 2013 and like it did last year? I wish I knew the answer. I will say, the thing that I've said for a long time is that Bitcoin gives you exposure to the upside of crypto, but it also minimizes your downside risk. Meaning that if you want exposure to crypto, you want to take on a risk, Bitcoin is going to be better than most everything else from a risk-adjusted returns perspective. That doesn't mean there's no other asset that's going to give better returns than Bitcoin. There's been a lot of altcoins that have given better returns than Bitcoin. But it's easy to pick them out in hindsight. It wasn't so easy to pick them out ahead of time. And a lot of people that claim to do so were also buying all those altcoins ahead of time all the way down as well. And also we're buying a lot of other altcoins that just went to zero or what didn't go anywhere, and then they just sort of cling to the ones that outperformed. Bitcoin has been the safer play, really. I mean, for the last several years. It's obvious because Bitcoin is the highest by market cap. Bitcoin has been around the longest. And ever since, the last few years, Bitcoin dominance has been going up. So if you're buying a collective basket of altcoins, you're taking on more risk and getting less reward because the Bitcoin dominance just keeps on going up. Now, if you look at something like others Bitcoin, it's everything outside of the top 10 and then divided by Bitcoin, it's just slowly working its way down this year. And this is something that a lot of people were really bullish on when 2024 began. If you remember, when others Bitcoin was up here, and look at this, just one lower high after another. And I think eventually it's going to make its way back down here. And honestly, I think it'll go below that. But the reason I think it'll go below that is because last cycle, you can see that others Bitcoin dropped 60% and then rallied 60%. And then as those rate cuts arrived, it dropped another 60%. Now this cycle, you can see that it dropped 60%. It rallied 60%. And as those rate cuts arrive, what happens if it just drops 60% down to about 0.11 or so? It's possible. It's possible. Bitcoin plus ETH dominance. It's still struggling to hold above that 73%, but I think that's the critical level that it needs to hold above. What's interesting is if you actually take total 3 and you don't subtract out USDT and you just divide it by Bitcoin, it actually just tagged the trend line, or it just tagged the level that it hit in September of 2018. Now you might say, well, that means there's a big move for altcoins coming if it follows that. Maybe alt Bitcoin pairs. I still think alt Bitcoin pairs are going to slowly go down because I think that this process here has already happened, right? And the reason I think that is because if you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, you can see that it already has, right? I mean, we've been in this range forever. See that? Here, this is the same thing. I think we've already accomplished. I think we've already gone through that. But if you do subscribe to this view that, now that we've hit that and that alt Bitcoin pairs are going to rally, It's possible, but this was in 2018 when Bitcoin then crashed 50%, right, at the end of the year after USDT dominance tagged that trend line. So, that might not even be the best outcome. Like if you're hoping for altcoins to do well. I mean, maybe they do well in their Bitcoin pairs if that's what happens, but that wouldn't be good for their USD pairs. I'm not in that camp, right? I'm not in that camp. I'm in the camp that Bitcoin dominance is going to keep going higher, that it's going to likely stay above its 20-week SMA. Here's Bitcoin dominance including stables. But if you look at Bitcoin dominance excluding stables, what do you notice? It's just been doing the same thing. It's always been doing, right? It actually looks really similar to back over here, where you see it got below the bull market support band, and then once it got above it, it first struggled to stay above it right here, and then it got back above it again, came back down, got back above it, and then finally had a big move up. Same thing, right? It got below it, struggled, came above it, and then struggled to hold it, came back down right here, kind of like right. So this one is that, and then this one is that. And then it started to finally hold it. So then here is that move right there. And then this one is right here, where now it's holding it, which means it's a waiting game, right? Which means that eventually it's likely going to start to go back up. And my guess is that when it does go back up, it's going to go to the top of this trend line. I think either by September or December. That's my guess. And then you basically connect the dots. Here, 2021, 2022. Didn't happen in 2023. We got close, but didn't happen. Connected in 2024. Then, when it connects theoretically in 2024, you go back and look, and you see that Bitcoin dominance retraced the entire move back up. And everyone spent every waking moment calling for alt season during a Bitcoin dominance rally. And they finally give up, and then alt season occurs. But I just think it's premature to call for alt season when we're still in a Bitcoin dominance rally. It's just what it is, guys. I mean, normally alt season doesn't occur until the Fed's printing money and we've gone back to lower rates, right? So that's where I stand on the market. I think it has elements of 2019 with gold breaking out and USDT dominance tagging that trend line at around 4%. We talked about that all year. I think it has elements of 2016 in the sense that ETH Bitcoin seems to be following 2016 a lot closer than 2019. I think it also follows 2016 in the sense of ROI after the halving. Looks a lot closer to 2016. But if you look at ROI after cycle peak, it kind of seems like, look, we're just getting some mean reversion here, right? If we are getting mean reversion and it follows 2019, it's a slow grind, right? It just kind of tags that trend line every few months, kind of like it did over here. And then eventually maybe it goes below it, and then that's what finally marks the low, whatever it's going to be. But definitely a lot of things to consider as it relates to the market. So again, you also have the divergence of Bitcoin with the S&P that we saw in 2019 as well. And yeah, so there's a lot of things to consider. I think in the short term, let's just see what happens at the end of this week. I'll probably do a video about the bull market support band soon, after we get the weekly close. At this point, we haven't even had a weekly close below the 21 week EMA. For reference, the key levels to watch, the 20-week SMA is at 65K. The 21-week EMA is just above 61K. So if we close below 61K, then that's a weekly close below the 21-week EMA. But again, 1 week's not enough. 1 week could be a fake out. You have to have multiple weeks. Because again, in 2013, you had 1 week down below the bull market support band, but then you just got right back above it. Right? You got right back above that 21-week EMA the following week. And that following week happened to be the week of July 8th. And we're about to, we're going to be starting the week of July 8th as well. Here, right? This will be the week of July 8th of 2024. So I think that it's important to look at that, right? Does it follow 2013 where it basically gets back above the 21-week EMA by July, by next week? Does it get back above that 21-week EMA next week? And then does it just slowly trend back up after putting in sort of these lower highs for a while? Or does it do what we did in 2019? Where it just kept on putting in lower highs and then did not get back above the bull market support band. So we will see. That's where we are. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.